Welcome back. We're now going to demonstrate how to use the saw in order to make a couple simple cuts for yourself. So the first thing we want to do before we start cutting any material up is we want to identify what kind of a saw blade we have and is it suitable for cutting the wood material we want. Before we're going to be going into where the saw blade is, we need to do a couple things. We need to first lock out the saw by removing the lockout tab from the main power switch so we can no longer turn on the saw. The saw is now disabled and or locked out so we can service it. The next thing we need to do then is we need to get into the area where the saw blade is, and we can take a look at the saw blade, and if we read on the side of the saw blade, it'll tell us what type of material the saw blade is acceptable for. In most cases, most wood shops, you are going to be just leaving the one blade in there for most of the operations. Depending on if you want to cut smooth cuts, rip cuts, or cross cuts, they will all take a slightly different blade. If we have to remove the blade, we have two wrenches. The wrenches will go into the blade assembly in here, and you will simply take the blade off, taking off the nut. Once you have the wrenches on there, you can pull the wrenches together and you can remove the saw blade. Okay. The saw blade, the one thing you have to make sure is when you take it off, there is a nut on the back side here. When you go to take it off, do not drop this down inside the saw. It is difficult to retrieve. Not impossible, just difficult. Then we can take the saw blade off like this. The saw blade now, to reinstall the saw blade, simply put it back on, make sure the teeth are pointing towards you, and we're going to be putting the saw blade on. Once we have the saw blade back on, we're going to be using the same two wrenches to tighten it up afterwards, and once we get it tightened up, we will be able to use the saw. The saw blade is now attached. Reinstall the throat plate. The throat plate is what keeps the wood material from falling down inside of the saw. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to check our blade height. To check our blade height, this is the handle that's going to lower the blade for us. We're going to lower the blade so that you are approximately half to one full tooth above the material that you're cutting. When the saw blade is at that height, the blade height is now set to the correct height. When we're making any of our cuts on the table saw using the fence, we do not have to measure the piece of wood and put pencil marks on there. You may if you wish, but it's not necessary because you're going to be measuring the distance between the fence and the saw blade. The material that's going to be between the fence and the saw blade is what's referred to as our good side. The waste side is going to be everything that we're going to be throwing away. The simplest way to set up our saw on here is to extend our tape measure past where we want it to be, put it up against the fence, and we're going to slowly move it across to the distance that we want. We want to cut this piece at 2 inches. So we're going to set up our saw blade so that it is just inside the fence at 2 inches. So the distance between the saw blade tooth that's going to be cutting and the fence is right at 2 inches on our tape measure. Okay. We now can push down the handle, lock the saw into place. We can now take our piece of wood and we're going to be cutting it through in this direction. Now before we start cutting with the saw, we are going to have to put in the lockout tab back into the saw again,